Now, I'm going to start by saying something that some of you might not initially like or agree with, which is that Jedi can be kinda boring. And I don't mean in terms of their philosophies or anything like that. That stuff actually fascinates me, and I believe there's much we can discuss, take away, and learn from them, even in the real world. I love making videos discussing the ins and outs of being a Jedi, as many of you probably know. Instead, I mean when it comes to putting them the way they should be on screen. That the things Yoda said about them to Luke in The Empire Strikes Back, that they're all about knowledge and defense and never attack or killing unless they absolutely have to, is, yeah, what they're really all about. Those are the fundamentals to being a Jedi, to seek peace and justice above all else, essentially. And when you're a company like Disney and Lucasfilm and you're trying to make an action film that'll make you a whole lot of money, having heroes who always try to negotiate and want to be peaceful, that are reluctant to ever fight or kill unless they absolutely must, well, they maybe don't or won't exactly make for the best action films possible in your opinion. They certainly won't be anything like most Marvel superheroes who sometimes kill very indiscriminately. In fact, I think there's a very good reason why George Lucas made the Empire the way he did, why they're this very colorless and nondescript looking regime of bad guys, why they command an army of faceless troopers, which is so you won't think too hard about Luke blowing up a couple 100,000 of them when he destroyed the first Death Star. It's also probably why in the prequels George Lucas made the enemy of the Jedi an army of droids that they could cut and hack and slash their way through without a second thought. And when you stop and really think about it, you'll realize that the Jedi very rarely actually kill any living beings in the prequels. And the only ones they do kill are two Sith, one of which comes back later, an evil cyborg that can barely be considered a living being, and then there was Yoda and Kenobi killing a bunch of clone troopers in revenge of the Sith after the clones turned on them. Though, in the films at least, those clone troopers were about as fleshed out as their battle droid counterparts or their stormtrooper counterparts from the original trilogy. And I don't think many watching back then really gave much thought to what they were doing when they were cutting their way through clone troopers to get to the Jedi Temple. Though after seeing the Clone Wars animated series, I have to say those scenes in Episode 3 with Kenobi and Yoda and the clone troopers, they do hit a bit differently now. But I digress, and speaking of prequel Jedi, they are of course not the perfect example of what Jedi should be, unless you count Qui-Gon Jinn, who was in there to show us what a Jedi really should be. But most of the rest of them at this time, they have become very dogmatic in their ways and follow the Jedi Code more stringently than following the will of the Force, which is what they really should be doing, letting the Force guide them so they can maintain balance. They've also, in a sense, become an enforcement arm of the Republic, especially when they become generals in the Clone Wars. In other words, those films did not show us the Jedi as they should be. Rather, they showed us them ready for a fall and defeat after 1,000 generations of keeping peace and justice across the galaxy. And it's kind of interesting to note that the High Republic era is now showing the lead up to that fall, showing us how they became so entangled with the Republic in the first place, and how they became rather proactive in the galaxy, you could say, going out there and trying to bring their light to virtually every corner of it. These are not Jedi who meditate on what to do and just follow the will of the Force. These are Jedi who build space station beacons for the galaxy to gaze upon and be reassured by. And when Lucasfilm first announced the High Republic era, or what it was going to be after at first a very strange and cryptic announcement where it was simply called Project Luminous, that seemed to imply a change to the Force was coming in its little teaser image, well, I thought it was a rather odd time period to explore in such depth, considering it was going to be spread out over 3 phases across several years of real-world time, and where there'd be dozens of books and comics. I mean, the years after the Sith went into hiding and before they re-emerged, that 1,000-year gap, has always been thought to be an era where not a whole lot happens on the galactic scale, where the Sith are, of course, in hiding and there are no major galaxy-sweeping wars or conflicts or anything quite like that. It's basically a time of relative peace in the galaxy. And though I, as someone who's been reading and keeping up with everything in the High Republic era, all the books and comics, even the young reader ones, I don't think it's been all that bad. There's been some interesting ideas and stories, as well as some, well, not as good stories or ideas either. And so overall, it's been kind of hit and miss, and now with us being a good, I'd say, halfway through the thing, well, I still fail to see why they've gone so heavily into all of this or this time period. Why they're spending so much time and effort showcasing or showing how the Jedi will ultimately fail and fall in the prequels. With there even being an upcoming Disney Plus series, The Acolyte, that will sort of cap off the story and this whole time period. And though, again, some of the High Republic stuff has been pretty good, it just feels like most of the adversaries that they've introduced for the Jedi to fight against have fallen a bit flat in terms of how good or interesting they are. Including the most recent ones here in the second phase, that being what is called the Path of the Open Hand, who believe the Force should not be used, that the Jedi are evil because they bend it to their will, which they believe basically causes bad things to happen or for the whole thing to become out of whack. And though I could probably make a whole video discussing how odd I find the Path of the Open Hand, at least thus far, anyway, to me it all sounds eerily similar to Luke's stupid beliefs in The Last Jedi, where he seems to think that the Jedi think or once thought that the Force belonged to them in some capacity, or that without them there could be no light in the galaxy. And good or bad, say what you will about Luke in that film, but I've always found it utterly baffling how he comes to that conclusion that the legacy of the Jedi is failure, that after 1,000 generations, or roughly 25,000 years, it going astray over the course of maybe a couple hundred years, as now implied by the High Republic, and then being outsmarted and defeated by perhaps the greatest Sith to ever live at their lowest point, that it is somehow a legacy of failure. And though yes, Luke does change his tune a bit in The Rise of Skywalker, I still can't help but wonder if current modern-day Lucasfilm and Disney want to see the Jedi Order sort of changed. If they want them to potentially be a little more, shall we say, edgy and action-oriented. If they wouldn't like to see them be a little more like superheroes. I can't help but wonder, when you just look at everything they've done, if they're maybe doing all of this to justify Rey building a very different type of Jedi Order from what it once was. And yes, for the record, Luke's Jedi Order in the expanded universe, or Legends as we call it now, was not like the one we see in the prequels. He made changes, though it should also be noted that much of Luke's story in the EU happened before the prequels ever came out or were finished. For example, Luke marries Mara Jade in a comic book that came out in late 1999, shortly after The Phantom Menace came out, and before we truly started to learn the Jedi's anti-attachment rules in Attack of the Clones a couple years later. And so, for better or worse, if the writers of some of those pre-prequel written EU stories that were set in the post-original time period, if they had somehow seen or known what was going to be in the prequels first, I think they likely would have told different stories after Return of the Jedi. But anyway, as much as that would be a fun debate, I think, going back to Rey's Jedi Order, which we'll be seeing in the next Star Wars film, it is, as I'm sure you've already heard, supposed to indeed be about Rey's Jedi Order, the next movie I mean. And so I do wonder, when you again look at all of it, if they will be going with this silly concept of balance being something somewhere between the dark and the light, a concept that does not even remotely fit into George Lucas's view of the Force. But since we know they are not really all that worried about always adhering to George Lucas's ways, I can't help but wonder if Rey, born to a Palpatine and trained, I guess, by a Skywalker, if she will be the one to finally see and understand the true nature of the Force, that balance lies between the two. Which really will just mean, for the sake of movies being exciting, that she'll be able to do cool dark side stuff like Force lightning, which she has already done on accident. And I honestly believe that's like the only reason people do love the idea of Grey Jedi. They want to see Jedi doing cool things and not being quite so straight-laced because they love their anti-heroes and maybe don't care so much about any type of deeper meaning to Star Wars or the Force or the Jedi. And before you completely dismiss this idea or say you don't think they would ever do anything so drastic to the Jedi, and mind you, I do not want to see this happen, but before you dismiss, again remember the High Republic era is spending years worth of time, dozens and dozens of books and comics, showing why and how the Jedi of the old way, the prequel way, failed. And again, there's the era's culmination series coming to Disney+. There's The Acolyte, where the showrunner, Leslie Headland, has already said, it won't be kind to the Jedi. And along with all this, I don't think it's any coincidence that another movie coming soon, or at least announced, is a Dawn of the Jedi film that will be a biblical in nature story, according to its writer, and will explore the formation of the first or original Jedi Order. And they are the ones who, I think we can safely assume, wrote the books that Rey got from the first Jedi Temple in The Last Jedi and will be learning a great deal from. And if those Jedi are anything like the Jedi from Legends, from the original Dawn of the Jedi series, she may be reading a whole lot about balance being something between dark and light. And yes, I could be way off here about all of this. I could be reading way too much into things. I'm pretty good at that, I must admit. But one way or another, I don't think Rey is just going to build the same old Jedi Order that we saw in the prequels, and I'm not saying I think she necessarily should. I've said before that the sequels should have been Luke exploring or grappling with just what it means to be a Jedi or to rebuild the Order. What has he personally learned, and what can he look back on 25,000 years of history and learn? And though, yes, I do think it should have been Luke doing all that and not Rey, as I've said before, I will give the movie and the post-sequel trilogy era time period on the whole, I will give it a chance. And I will understand if they move away somewhat from the prequel era beliefs. I do think there were some flaws in their thinking if you really want to get into the nitty-gritty details. That said, if they change what, say, balance is, if they start using crazy new force powers all the time and make Star Wars feel too much like Marvel, well then, I will be done with Star Wars for good, and I do not say that lightly. Well, that's all I got for you this time. Now it's your turn to tell me what you think about all this. Do you think a foundation has been laid or is being laid to give us a whole new take on the Jedi Order? Or do you think not even Disney and modern-day Lucasfilm are dumb enough to mess with all that? Whatever you think, leave those comments below and let's talk some Star Wars. And until next time, thanks for watching.